My name is Mark Masterson, and I'm the head of research and development at NTT Data in the UK. R&D is a really interesting function at NTT Data in the UK because our objective for the company is to source and find new sources of revenue for the company, things that it's never done before, novel, unusual, alien DNA. And as a consequence, the topic of innovation is integral to everything that we do. This question, what is innovation, is a question that has haunted my career, frankly. I think I mentioned to you the first time that we met that the first time I had head of innovation in a job title on my CV was more than a decade ago. What I found useful over time is kind of a framework where I break it down by parts of speech, frankly. I think in general, people think of innovation in three broad categories. It's a noun, so it's an object, it's a thing. This is an innovation. Imagine Elon Musk on stage pointing at some shiny new thing behind him, or Steve Jobs classically saying one more thing and holding aloft something that we're all meant to be excited about. And I think this is the way most people think about innovation. When they talk about its impact on their lives, the pace of it and change, even if it's a piece of software and something that's not physically material, it's still a noun, it's a thing. Facebook is an object in this sense. The other way that people often think about it as a verb. So this is something I do. I seek to innovate. I want to create a new thing. I want to behave in a way that is novel and interesting and that creates new value. And this is innovate. And I think this is the way that most corporate programs think about it, as a verb, as an activity, as a thing that can be defined in this way. And then the third way that you can use the word is as an adjective, as a thing that describes something else. So this is when we say something is innovative or someone is innovative. And this is the one that I find the most interesting, because it's in the adjective space that we start to get into what I think is the really most powerful and impactful version of the word, which is where we get into the slippery space of culture. When I was at Google, I found myself, after a number of years, starting to teach a course there to senior managers about how to create a culture of innovation inside high-performing teams. And I think I often mention that when I'm talking about it in this context, because I think it's useful, because often I find that the mere fact that Google still has to have courses internally for its managers about this concept is often something that people find startling. They seem to think that Google just magically goes into the nearest kitchen, drinks some Google coffee, and it just happens somehow, but it doesn't. It takes work. And in my own experience, fostering this cultural substrate, the cultural things that are necessary to get the other two manifestations of innovation going is the really important bit. It's the part that I focus on the most in that. What I've often seen as kind of an anti-pattern is that a narrow focus on innovation as a verb, on the process, is often, frankly, characterized by magical thinking. If I do this, then my people will be innovative. If they adopt this practice, if they use this tool, if they copy this particular thing from Google or Amazon or Facebook, then all of a sudden we'll be just like them. Of course, that's a profound fallacy. That never works. Equally, focusing on the noun is a deeply frustrating and rarely very productive way of trying to get better at this, because that's the output. That's the end state of something. And trying to kind of, for yourself, work out for first principles how to get from where you are to there is often completely impossible. The cultural ingredients of innovation, the stuff that, for example, this course was based on at Google, are all about how to create high-performing teams, really. That's at the core of it. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there's no rocket science in this. A big part of, for example, this particular course was around psychological safety, around empowering your people to feel safe to fail. All of this stuff that we all know and understand, but you can't embody in a static process or capture in a tool. You have to build it into the interpersonal, social infrastructure of your organization and make sure that your teams understand it, believe it, buy into it, and start to behave in a certain way. That's ultimately the key. The analogy that I like to use, one that I learned, frankly, kind of in its most visceral form while I was at Google, is venture capital. So we think about different modalities of investing. If you're looking for a guaranteed dividend return, you do not invest in the same portfolio of stocks as a venture capitalist would, who's looking for that one big hit. So the portfolio of a venture capitalist very typically resembles the portfolio you were just discussing. Several hundred bets, many of them profoundly speculative and expected to fail, under the assumption that statistically, as a kind of a function of the probability of the overall portfolio, one or two of them will succeed so extraordinarily well that they'll pay for the rest. And most really successful innovation programs around the world at big corporates are set up to run that way, with that understanding that this is a portfolio management problem, that I'm managing a portfolio of risks with those expectations, and it's this kind of risk, it's this category of risk, and I'm seeking these returns, not those, and therefore it all kind of makes sense. It's when that level of self-awareness is absent and there's kind of an expectation that it will behave like a blue chip stock and give me that dividend 12 months later, that you get this really profound disconnect and unhappy people. In terms of the relationship to failure, again, I think my experience at Google is the best example of it. It's similar to the Pixar failure parties that you're talking about. One of the surest ways to get promoted at Google is to try to do something really interesting, fail at it, and document that failure really well. That will get you promoted, almost as fast as being really successful in the market with some new product. I think I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of places like Google and Amazon, because there is a bell curve, and there is an anti-pattern that starts to manifest itself at places like that, where the only way you can get promoted is by doing something new and novel and exciting and interesting. So one of the reasons why people often complain Google brings out 5 different products for the same thing. Think about messaging recently with Duo and Allo and Google Meet and Hype Chats and all Hangouts, all the other things. It's because within the company, people are only rewarded for creating a new thing, not from maintaining successfully something that's already out there and is a success. That's boring. That doesn't get you promoted. And so there's a spectrum here, and even really innovative companies still suffer from problems. It's just they have a different set of problems than the ones who are struggling to get anything innovative done at all. I think it leads directly, for example, to why my team at NTT Data is called Research and Development, and it's not the innovation team. I think the key thing there is to understand that even when we're thinking about innovation as a noun, we're seeking to get an innovation and take it to market. It's still a means to an end, because whatever that noun is, its purpose is to sell some products, make the business some money, penetrate a new market. Apple didn't create an iPhone in order to gift the world with a more beautiful artifact. They did it to make money. It was a means to an end. And I think that often that one easily loses sight of that. So that's the first part, I think, is to recognize that innovation is a means to an end, and understanding what that objective is, the business goal that one is seeking to achieve, is the essential first step. I think the second piece then is to understand that narratives are really important. The stories that we tell about ourselves and to ourselves matter. They're important. And, our marketing people understand that when they're talking about branding. But when we're talking about things that seem as mundane as organizational design, it's also easy, I think, to lose sight of that. Not many corporate leaders necessarily reflect on how important these things are. And so if you refer to a team as an X team or a moonshot team or a team that does innovation, that's what they'll do. That's the story they'll tell about themselves. That's the story they'll tell to other people about who they are. And those are the outcomes that you'll get. My team, for example, is called Research and Development, because what I'm seeking to do is find, research new sources of revenue for the company and then take them to market, develop. I sometimes get feedback from people who bump into me at a conference or whatever, and they say, why is it R&D? You're not, like inventing things with test tubes. And I say, well, no, but since when did that become the definition of research and development? Why do I have to be wearing a lab coat, splicing genes to be doing R&D? R&D for me is researching what my market wants and what my customers need, and understanding that, hey, big important thing, and then developing things to meet those needs. And so I think if we think about objectives and the stories that we want to tell ourselves about how we want to get there, those two things are essential, not just to this topic of innovation in general, obviously, but those are essential in this space in particular because it's so loaded and people get so excited about it. The kind of approach where, this kind of magical thinking approach where I will adopt without really understanding or giving a lot of thought or thinking about any of those two things we just talked about, objectives or stories, narratives around things. I'm just going to adopt blindly some practice. I'm going to do design thinking, or I'm going to your point, set up a lab somewhere. This is magical thinking. This is, if I do this, the great thing will happen. And of course that never works. And I think that's rife. I think that's really common. And there are reasons for that. It's often the path of least resistance. It's often a way to tick a box and be seen to do something without actually doing. There's lots of organizational politics sorts of reasons why that behavior is very common. You need a level of distance from the primary organization and space to do things differently and experiment. That's necessary. And you then need a way to take what you learn back into the larger organization and integrate it properly within that part of the organization as well. Vannevar Bush, one of the architects of DARPA in the United States, famously used to talk about artists and soldiers, and how he had to find a way to be a conduit between the artists, who were the thinkers and the innovative folk, and the soldiers on the ground, who then had to take that stuff into combat and actually use it. And I think that metaphor as a story applies very well in business. I think we need to find a way to give the artists the space that they need to think up the new thing and then integrate it back. If you think about an example like Apple and Jony Ive's team designing things in splendid isolation, but then being able to successfully take them into manufacturing, get them to market them, take all of that stuff. Apple's a great template for how that can work. That is a really profound challenge. And I don't think there is any magical silver bullet to solve it. It's just a lot of really hard, boring work. Setting up the space for the artists, forming the mechanisms that you need as conduits, feeding them. I'm often reminded of Professor Brian Cox, who famously tells a joke about entropy always wins in our universe. And so that means that when you don't want it to, and you're basically supporting some system, you have to keep pouring energy into it to keep it going. And so once you've set up such a thing, you have to keep putting energy in it to keep it going. It's not enough to set up the conduits once. You have to nurture them and guide them, and they have to evolve over time and all of that stuff. Those are the key things that make such a program successful, and it's really hard. I think open innovation is one of these really interesting topics. And the first time I bumped into it was when pharmaceutical companies and drug companies in the States started to do competitions and things 15 years ago, where they would outsource or crowdsource to get new scientific ideas developed from a large consortium. I've seen that model applied repeatedly in the corporate world with varying degrees of success. And I suspect that the secret of that success is the same as what we were just talking about in terms of entropy. If you pour enough energy into that model and give it the right support and love and nurturing that it needs, it can be very successful. If you don't, and you do a bit of magical thinking there as well, you'll get that same sort of dull and uninspiring outcome. I think the key to unlocking innovation in any context is a profound degree of humility, is of knowing that you don't know enough and being really curious and wanting to go find out more. And as a kind of base posture, if you can take that as a team, as a company, then that naturally leads to a desire to seek out partners and other collaborators, because you will immediately realize that there are people who know more about this particular part of the problem than you do, or who have some extraordinary piece of stuff that adds value to a particular problem that would be really useful to you. So within my team at NTT Data in the UK, my team specifically is profoundly oriented around this concept. We're kind of basically trying to simultaneously do two things in R&D at NTT Data UK. Develop new things, but that's a new journey for NTT Data. NTT Data is not historically a products company. We haven't historically been famous for developing our own IP, and so that's a slow bet, one with a fairly long timeline, and there's a journey that we need to go on to get better at that. In order for me to balance that portfolio, I need a set of kind of faster bets, higher impact bets. And the way for me to do that is to go seek partners who already have established value propositions that might be useful to my customers. And so those two components, develop some stuff, partner with some people, are the primary components of R&D within NTT Data UK. And the partner program is all about us. Our research is identifying our customers' needs and then seeking a value proposition in the market that looks like it could meet them. And where we find that, seeking to be the matchmaker that brings them together. We have a partner program for small and medium businesses. I don't like to use the word startups in this context because I find it very loaded, that we call the Bento Box program. And the Bento Box program is designed to find these really interesting smaller companies and bring them to our Be a Myth customers. When that works, we call that the triple win. That's our super cool hashtag for the success that we like to see there. Because we get something out of it, the partner gets something out of it, the customer gets something out of it. Equally, gigantic alliances with companies like Microsoft, Adobe are essential to our success together with our customers, because that's how we find new things. It's the intersection of those new things. I once sat down with a chap who was at the time working at Joyent, who were a pioneering cloud computing company about 10 years ago. And he spoke to me about gardening. And he said, you know, the really interesting stuff in a garden always happens at the edges of things, between two things. It's that intersection of things where new things grow and bloom. And that has stuck with me forever, because that's absolutely true in an organizational sense and in a product design sense. It's the intersections between things where new things happen. And so from that perspective, finding that partner proposition and matching it up to something else and then taking it to the customer is a huge part of what we're seeking to do within R&D at NTT Data. And for me, that's the most potent version of open innovation.